Good evening. It is time for Althing Considered, where we get together on a Friday night and tackle a topic in heathenry. My name is Lauren Crow. I'm president and CEO of the Troth. And with me tonight is my favorite communications director.
Your only communications director, Ben
Details.
Ben Kowalski, also for the purposes of this conversation, known as Benny the Younger, sometimes Benny the Lesser.
Or also sometimes not my Ben and my Ben, because we have with me my Ben, my kindred brother, the wonderful Dr. Ben, Slayer of Foemen, Waggoner, biologist, writer, translator, Shope, which is our Shope, which is no longer our director of publications. In fact, Shope is now our honorary title, honoring Ben's almost over 20 years of our director of publications for the Troth. And so Shope is now our title to honor him, and he is now our keeper of the lore, hoarder of wisdom, and best of all, debunker of bad science. And that's what we're here for tonight.
Let's hope so. After 25 years of teaching evolution in the state of Arkansas, I think I have a certain amount of expertise in that field.
Yes, definitely. You even got baited one time into debating a creationist. That was funny story that ended up. I saw that recently on a completely non-related to anything I'm part of video. That was wild. So
yeah, that's about as useful an exercise as nailing Jello to the ceiling.
I understand. So tonight we are here to talk about the controversial and completely bull hockey pseudoscience of metagenetics. But before we get there, Ben, I believe we have some news and updates to discuss.
Oh, yes, we do.
Yeah. Benny KG, roll that lovely intro.
Yay.
Thanks so much, Ben.
What was that?
So,
what indeed?
Magic,
what it was.
So first off, we want to remind you guys, Fifth Forge is coming up on 13th to the 16th of April. I'm going to be there. We're going to have people from heathen groups all around the world gathering together. It's an international conference of inclusive heathen organizations, kindreds, and individuals, as well as the broader pagan community and interfaith allies. And it's a really great time to get together in Costa Rica. We're going to be at this really cool eco resort and having a really great time. I believe the theme that we came together on is going to be about environment in the future. So we are peace in the environment, and the peace environment in the future is the theme this year. So we're going to start taking applications for workshops and presentations on that, but really the focus this year is going to be on creating a sustainable and just future. So really excited about that, excited to have that opportunity to get together. That is going to, of course, sponsored by the Troth and the Association Ásatrú Yggdrasil in Costa Rica, headed up by my friend Esteban. So looking forward to it. That information on that, of course, is on the Troth website. And also mark your calendars. Information has not gone up yet, but first weekend of June in California, Northern California, is going to be Troth Moot. Information on that should be up in the next couple of weeks. We're still nailing down ticket pricing and all that, of course. But so mark your calendars for that. And lots of great stuff. You want to go to our website, thetroth.org, because we do have other things coming up, and as well as regular occurrences like our twice a month Heathen Essentials study group that meets on Zoom, as well as things like our if you're someone who is struggling with addiction or mental illness, we have weekly meetings of Heathens in Recovery, and these are all open to people. You don't have to be a member of the Troth. These are open to everyone. So just a reminder.
Yeah, if you want to keep that dry January going all year long, you say you tried dry January and you thought, hey, that feels pretty good. I kind of want to do that all year long, but I might need some help. Heathens in Recovery is a good resource to kick bad habits, and just make you feel like a more whole person. So if that's what you need, I know I did dry January. I generally go dry from January to Sigerbloat. So if you're looking to go dry permanently, Heathens in Recovery can certainly help.
Well, it's not just that. If you're also struggling with mental health, we're in the middle of one of the largest mental health epidemics ever. It's also a great way to help with mental health. And it's a wonderful program. In fact, we really should have Michael on to talk about it and talk about the struggles of addiction and mental health, especially in a religion that causes so much alcohol. But I won't diverge from that anymore. Please go to our website, troth.org. We got a lot more information there. And that's as far as news and events, that's what I've got. So we can get into the topic and talk a little bit about metagenetics. And I promise we will try not to dive too much into. Ben cut me off. I promise this won't turn into a heathen history episode, even though Ben and I getting together, there's no guarantees. There will not be bad puns. And
it has been known to happen.
Who's joining us. Yeah, his wife and my husband both hate it.
Mm-hmm. One thing I do want to slap on here, though, since we are going to be talking about metagenetics and some of the people who espouse those theories and possibly contingent theories, and I just want to slap a big old content warning right here. Yeah, content warning transition. So we are going to be talking about some pretty heavy subjects here. If that's not your bag, feel free to stop the live stream, maybe pick it back up later. But our main topic is going to be pretty heavy. And to talk about it, I have one more transition in my pocket. I swear this is the last one. I know we introduced him before, but I want to introduce Ben with his expertise as well, just to talk about how long you said 25 years. So we're just going to. So tonight's guest is Dr.
Why does that keep happening?
Oh, because I keep clicking the button and you're the guest. So I want to intro the guest, Dr. Ben Waggoner, professor of biology.
Hi.
And I want to brag Ben out a little bit. So, because I've known this man now longer. Ben, at this point, I've known you longer than I've not known you almost. That's terrifying.
Yeah. With what? I had just become steward of Arklamis, and you were somebody I found on Witchfox, I think. And it was 2003?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have known you since I was 24. Mm-hmm. So I've known you 21 years. So,
dang.
And we've had a kindred for 20 of those. So, Ben is a professor of biology, although if I remember correctly, your specialty is invertebrate paleobiology.
Yeah, I technically study dead shit in rocks. But you have to know a bit about just about everything. A more dignified way of describing what I do than saying I study dead shit in rocks is that I just look at the broad picture of evolution. I look at change over time, and that includes a certain amount of study of the way that genes change over time and the way that they act change over time. It's all ultimately connected. Like, knowledge is all one, man. Whoa. So there. So that's where my training and my background overlap with some of the ideas that are current and still going around on the more racist side of the heathen spectrum.
And Ben also, Ben also has his PhD from one of the best programs in the country, University of California, Berkeley. Mm-hmm. I boast on him because he won't. And in addition to his undergraduate from Tulane, which I didn't get to go to, so I'm always just a little jealous.
Right. Well, it was while at Tulane, a good friend of mine made the acquaintance of a bunch of tarot card readers on Jackson Square. Who were pagan and who were Ásatru adjacent, although pretty eclectic. And they were the ones that told me about Ásatru for the first time. And this would have been in 1988, right after the old Ásatru Free Assembly had splintered and the Troth got founded. But I did not eventually end up joining. This sounded interesting at the time, but I didn't eventually end up joining and deciding this is what I was until 2001. And all the time I was
Yeah.
for a while. That I know Southerners like to slow cook things, but man,
right. And all the time I was at Berkeley, I was so deeply involved in, being a grad student that I never got around to seeking out Diana, who was there at the time. And things might have been a little bit different, but, as far as I know, our paths never crossed until I'd left. So that's just, one of those things. But yeah, grad school at Berkeley it's different from heathenry, and the reason is that Odin hanging on Yggdrasil only lasted 9 nights.
And
yeah. Getting a PhD takes even longer and is arguably just as strangely transformative in some ways.
And if you're familiar, you know the name Ben Waggoner, and you're going, where do I know this name? That's because Ben is also the author of Our Troth, as well as, I used to know the number, but I can't remember it. But let's just say I do know for a fact he has translated more old Icelandic and Old Norse sagas into modern English than anyone else currently. You hold that record right now still. So
okay.
You do. So if you were wondering where you've seen that name, if you've studied heathenry at all, that is where you know Ben's name. So he is very well accomplished. I am always incredibly proud to be known as his kindred sister and one of his friends. And I'm absolutely excited that you are here. And Ben is actually in my house right now because his internet's not great. So I stuck him in our he's in the apartment in my house. So we're yelling at each other across the house doing this. It's great. So, Ben, I think that the most thing we need to talk about is let's establish our terms.
All right.
So, I think that means that the first thing we've got to talk about is metagenetics. What is it?
Okay. It's not a term used in the scientific mainstream. It's never particularly taken off. In fact, if you do a Google search on it, Google keeps redirecting me to Metagenics, which is apparently some kind of nutritional supplement program or something like that. I don't even know what it is.
It's one of those things that supposedly will raise your testosterone and make you feel more like a man. If the commercials on the radio I hear occasionally are to be believed.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Better stay away from that stuff or I might explode. Anyway, I digress. In 1980, a fellow by the name of Stephen McNallen is leading the Ásatru Free Assembly, which had just a couple of years ago changed its name from the Viking Brotherhood. And the Viking Brotherhood / A Free A is ultimately the ancestor of most organized heathenry in the U.S., one way or the other, including the Troths, because when the A Free A fell apart in 87, a prominent member by the name of Edward Thorson felt that somebody needed to pick up the fallen Raven banner and founded this organization in the backyard of his house in Austin called the Ring of Troth, which brings us to evolved into the Troth, and that's where we are now. McNallen had always been politically conservative. He was in ROTC at that great hotbed of liberalism, Midwestern State University in Wichita Falls, Texas.
I thought he went to I thought he went to Stephen F. Austin.
No, it was Midwestern State.
Oh.
Are you guys aware of? Did he get his degree in biology?
I think it might have been political science. But what he did after graduation was commission into the Army as an officer. He'd been in ROTC and ended up spending 4 years in the U.S. Army as an airborne ranger stationed in Germany for a good portion of that. And right during his senior year of college was when he founded the Viking Brotherhood, and he kept it going all through his deployment. And once he got back to the States, he first settled in Berkeley, of all places, but ended up moving to the Central Valley. So he was in Turlock for a while, poor man. And he changed the Viking Brotherhood to the Ásatrú Free Assembly. 1980 was when they had their first Althing. So this really is, Althing Considered. Yeah, right. And in 1980, he published a short article in the journal that the AFA was putting out called The Runestone. And it laid out an idea that he called metagenetics, which is the idea that religious affinities are transmitted along genetic lines. They're inherited through your DNA. That the religion that you are naturally intended to follow, the one that truly brings you home and clicks with your nature and is fundamentally right, is ultimately determined by your ancestry, by lines of descent. And so somebody who is of predominantly African or Asian descent trying to worship Odin and Thor is fundamentally unnatural in some way.
Ben, do you mind if I share a really quick quote from that metagenetics article?
Please do.
And this is interesting because this shows how they use metagenetics as a way to justify their exclusiveness.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most controversial tenets of Ásatru is our insistence that ancestry matters, that there are spiritual and metaphysical implications to heredity, and that we are thus a religion not for all of humanity, but rather one that calls only its own. This belief of ours has led to much misunderstanding that's bad. As a result, I think that's what that's supposed to say, but it's not clear. Some have attempted to label us as racist or have accused us of fronting for totalitarian political forms. So that is from Be Still My Heart. It's the idea there. I mean, that's from specifically from that article that he wrote in the Runestone.
Right. The article goes on to, he calls this metagenetics, and he tries to find evidence for it, and a lot of it is basically late 70s parapsychology stuff. There's mention of Dr. Rhine's ESP experiments at Duke University, and some case studies that were being published at the time suggestive of reincarnation, things like that. And he would later go on, and I think 88, to publish an update in the Runestone, in which he came to argue that he still believed in it and still thought it was accurate, but that spirituality might not be carried in DNA as it's currently understood. So your natural religion is hereditary, except it doesn't follow DNA the way we currently understand it, which is a very nice way of moving the goalposts.
I have a quote from that too.
Was there a changing in from 1980? So just putting on the scientist hat for a second, history of science from 1980 to 1988, when McNally updates and revises. There's a lot of understanding about genes that evolves from 1980 to 1988, and then further from the 80s to the 90s when we get the Human Genome Project, all these other ways of mapping the human genome. So do you think that when in 1980, so imagining the state of gene understanding of genes in 1980, could McNally have just been like banking on the mystery of the gene at the time, and since most people might have been ignorant, just kind of going, maybe it's in there?
Well, I don't think the science itself fundamentally changed that much, but saying that something is in your genes sounds cool. It sounds, it's in the double helix, the two strands of life twisted. And even though McNallen later backtracked and said maybe metagenetics doesn't depend on DNA as we understand it, the A Folk A still puts out a booklet that they will happily sell you with these essays reprinted, and it's got a computer graphic of a DNA molecule on the cover. Invoking DNA gives a certain degree of gravitas, of authority to what he's trying to say.
Yeah, and
And let me-
finality and immutability as well, right? Like there's this final immutable characteristic, cannot be changed. It is bedrock. It is
Right.
It's something that simply must be acknowledged, which is at the end of the day, I think very appealing to people with these kinds of ideologies, these bedrock beliefs that must not ever be challenged, cannot be. It is written in the bone itself. Like that's
Yeah, it's this idea that humanity can be divided into a very small number of simple types of people that are fundamentally different from each other, and you don't have to worry about nuance. You don't have to worry about messiness or anything like that. We have these people, and we have those people, and we have these people, and never the twain need to meet.
And they have clear, distinct characteristics.
Right.
Like D&D for people. Like every single race has its characteristics, right? Strengths, weaknesses, and these are again immutable traits inherent to each race.
If I can jump way back in the history of science for a minute. This is not stuff that I think McNallen himself has ever been particularly interested in, but in the US in the early 19th century, there was a common belief held by many scientists and doctors at the time called polygenism, which is pre-Darwin. So this is the idea that God created all of humanity, but Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and that only applies to the white people. And the other races had other origins. They weren't really our own species. And therefore, the corollary, which is why this was popular in the American South, is that enslaving Africans is morally no different from domesticating horses and cows. I've got something to read by a mostly forgotten guy by the name of Samuel Cartwright. He's most notorious today he was a doctor, and he diagnosed Africans with a very peculiar illness called drapetomania, which is the irrational and illogical desire to run away from slavery. And he considered this a disease. He considered this a disease that was peculiar to the African race and part of their essential makeup, and could not be treated the way you would treat the disease of a white person. I wish I was making this up. The treatment of drapetomania was vigorous stimulation of the skin with an oiled leather strap. That the medical treatment for the irrational desire to run away is to be beaten. It sounds like a sick joke, and it was not.
It sounds like a antebellum trolling, right? In a way.
Well, here's what I've got up here is a paper of his from 1855. Our northern states, like Europe, contain but one race of men, and all the medical instruction of the books and schools in that region is confined to that one race. But here in the South, we have two distinct races of people living in juxtaposition in nearly equal numbers, differing widely in their anatomy and physiology, and consequently requiring a corresponding difference in their medical treatment. A whole bunch of many illustrious men have long ago demonstrated by dissections so great a difference in the organization of the African from that of the white man as to induce the majority of naturalists to refer him to a different species having a different origin.
So when you're talking about this, when we're talking about, we were just talking about like beliefs being in the bone, in the DNA.
Yeah.
Beliefs, race, and let's call them what they are, racist,
Yeah.
supremacist beliefs are so written into a general cultural soup in which people grow up and people are influenced by, that it produces something in the 80s, centuries after.
The idea that there are fundamentally separated classes of people that can't be interchanged and that can't fill each other's natural places in life without being fundamentally unnatural, that idea is as old as, as old as heck. That's been around for a very long time. It started falling apart from the scientific point of view in the 1920s, and by about 1950 is when you get scientists like Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, by the way, distinguished geneticist, pointing out that when you look at human races, you find that they're incredibly fuzzy things. They're not fixed. They appear and they disappear. They change over time. Humans vary, but that variation cannot neatly be pigeonholed into a limited number of tiny little boxes. They flow, they change, they're temporary, and they don't really have anything to do with intellect or with character or anything like that. That's in a publication coming out just after World War II from this new organization called UNESCO that had just been founded. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization.
Now, I will say McNallen's first metagenetics essay, he wrote something that is very similar. No doubt an earlier and deeper psychic development where it's still impossible to distinguish between Aryan, Semitic, Hamitic, or Mongolian mentality, which, by the way, so many completely outdated words for races there. All human races have a common collective psyche, but with the beginning of racial differentiation, essential differences are developed in the collective psyche as well. For this reason, we cannot transplant the spirit of a foreign religion in globo onto our own mentality without sensible injury to the latter. So even there, he's basically saying, these races are all completely different, even on a, mental level, psychic level, whatever. He is definitely professing that. And I do know that while it may not necessarily have been something he was interested in, that certainly was present in the writings that Elsa Christensen probably exposed him to, because you saw that shift. Sorry, now we're getting into heathen history. I'm sorry. But yeah, sorry. But yeah, I'm just saying, like, it's definitely, I can see him having some exposure to the ideas at least.
And this is going to seem like a bit of a history dive, but I promise I'm going to bring it back to relevance. I mentioned that by about the 1950s, anthropologists were getting over the idea of race as any kind of fixed, boxed-in category. This is really not a new position for people to take. But there was a backlash in some very conservative circles, and one of the people funding it was a reclusive millionaire who'd made his money in textiles from New England by the name of Wycliffe Draper. And Draper set up a charity called the Pioneer Fund with his millions, which was supposed to promote racism as intellectually respectable, able to go toe to toe with the anti-racist and debate them and beat them on their own turf. He funded the production of a journal that's still in print called Mankind Quarterly, and they have funded a number of other initiatives, including a big study of human genetics, and especially human genetics as worked out through family histories and studies of twins, based at the University of Minnesota. So the Pioneer Fund has both funded some very blatantly racist books and pamphlets, the kind of tracts you might get slipped under your door in the 60s if you were known to be agitating for desegregation. And it's also funded some academically respectable sounding studies. And yes, Karina, I note you say in the chat that the idea was present among modern physicians to this day that African American women didn't need pain medication. Yeah, that goes back. There were 19th century people, physicians, who believed that that was evidence of racial inferiority, that white people's nervous systems were more delicate and refined and sensitive, whereas all of those other people, well, they just didn't feel pain like we do. That was a serious idea at the time, and even though there's no support for it at all, it's the kind of attitude that just tends to propagate.
It would be the kind
and I
of
would say if you want to see a good deep dive on that, go check out John Oliver's show Last Week Tonight. Did a really good deep dive on that, and it's here on YouTube. About that whole research and everything. So that way we don't have to go fall down that rabbit hole.
Right. Okay, so you have this counter movement coming in, and it's mostly funded by Wycliffe Draper's Pioneer Fund, which is still around today. And ideas coming from the Pioneer Fund, published in the Mankind Quarterly, pushed by white supremacist academics like Philip Rushton and people like that, have circulated quite a bit in the far right, what I would have called the far right fringe, until, I think events over the past decade are suggesting it's really not quite that fringy at all, but it circulates among the sort of people that McNallen has been known to hang out with.
So, are we thinking something like John Birch? So, just to name a few organizations that these publications might influence: John Birch Society. I know that there was also some influence in the early A of the National Alliance. I know that they used to advertise in the old Runestone. Used to advertise the Turner Diaries in the old Runestone as well. So. Lots of stuff going back and forth there. So as metagenetics kind of gets out there, what's been the response to metagenetics, like in the community and outside of it?
Okay, in the scientific community, nobody has ever heard of this stuff. Having said that, there have been empirical studies, and they've been funded by the University of Minnesota's twin studies, which have been getting some funding from the Pioneer Fund. So this is not exactly, liberal biased research. They've been looking at a quantity that you can, in principle, measure. The science itself is not intrinsically bad. Called heritability. And when you hear people talk about, maybe you might have heard someone say that your intelligence is 70% genes and 30% environment or something like that, that's what they're referring to. Now, your own intelligence, an individual's intelligence cannot be partitioned that way. I mean, your height is about 70% genetic, but that doesn't mean that 49 inches of your height came from genes and the other 32 inches of your height came from the fact that you ate your Wheaties. Heritability measures a trait that varies in a population and tries to identify how much of the variation in the population is caused by members of the population having different genes, and how much of the variation in the population is caused by members being exposed to different environments. And what's called narrow sense heritability is the fraction of genetic variance in the population as a fraction of the total variance. This is the point where my students usually start looking glassy-eyed, but let me see if I can break this down a little better. I can measure a quantity called the variance. It's the square of the standard deviation, if there's any stats people out there. Just by taking I could take a bunch of people and measure everybody's height. And that would be more or less a bell curve. I'd have a few really short people on one end and a few really tall people on one end, and most of us are kind of in the middle. And I could measure what amounts to the width of that curve. You know, is everybody grouped very tightly around the middle, or is there a great big spread from Kentucky Derby jockeys to basketball centers? And I can assign a number to that. And I can try to work out how big the spread would be if everybody in the population had exactly the same genes, but different environments of growing up, and how big the spread would be if everybody had different genes, but all lived in exactly the same environment. And there's ways you can try to calculate that. And, okay. If you can't hit it. What the Minnesota group found is that there is some seemingly genetic influence on a trait that they call self-transcendence. And that's not religiousness as such. You can measure it by the tendency to do things like read the scriptures of your religion or spiritual practice. Your tendency to pray, your frequency of times that you feel awe and wonder, and like the old country song says, that you feel small when you stand beside the ocean. Your tendency to go to spiritual practitioners of whatever tradition you have for advice and counsel and things like that. There is a limited degree of narrow sense heritability for that personality trait. If your parents were complete cement heads, you've got a slightly greater chance of being one too, although it's certainly not the only determining factor there. There is no heritability at all of specific religion. People asked the question and they got the answer that having parents that are Baptists does not intrinsically mean that there's some sort of genes that predispose you to being a Baptist. Religions often do get passed down in family lines. You know, you often stay with the religion that you're raised in, or, you know, people did until recently. Things seem to be a lot looser now, but there's no evidence that that has anything to do with the DNA that you inherited. There's nothing about your DNA that makes you likely to jump into swimming pools and enjoy ice cream socials and refuse to dance, or, you know, or whatever it is that Baptists do.
I would say also.
So there's nothing. So what you're saying is there's nothing in my parents' DNA that makes them that makes my dad not want to talk to other Baptists in the liquor store.
Right. Exactly. Hmm.
Okay.
And
mean,
I wouldn't necessarily use the word. A quote has come up in the chat where someone asks if it's down to the degree of indoctrination. I don't know that I'd use the word indoctrination, but there certainly are a lot of things that are transmitted in families that have nothing to do with your genes, and one of them's language. You know, I speak English because that's what my parents spoke to me, you know, all the way back when I was an infant. That's the language that I learned in my home. And I'm sure it's true for almost everybody listening to this, but there are no genes that make you an English speaker. Back in the, I'm dating myself here, but back in the early 90s, there was a Korean American comedian whose act mostly revolved around the fact that he looked like he had just stepped off the boat, and yet he had grown up in Nashville and spoke with a very Southern twang. And a lot of his acts revolved around the contrast between what he looked like and what he sounded like. And so he told jokes along the lines of, yeah, when I was growing up, the kids played cowboys and Indians, and I hated it because I always had to be the cook. Which was funny when he said it. I don't know that I can really pull it off, but yeah. But yeah, there is nothing in the genetic background of a Korean that means he has to speak with a Korean or speak with a Korean accent. I didn't really realize this until I came to Berkeley and I had Asian students who were fully ethnically Asian and yet spoke fluent Valley Girl and fluent Stoner. And yeah, they had grown up speaking exactly what they heard. And I wouldn't call that process indoctrination, but it is true that a lot of things get passed down in family lines that have nothing to do with your genes. And disentangling what really is genetic and what isn't has always been kind of a messy business.
I would say that it's more of a, I guess you could call it less about indoctrination and more of a nature v nurture and chicken and egg situation.
Right.
And what about, like, if we're thinking about experiments,
Mm-hmm.
and if we think that, and if we let's do like a counterfactual. So presume that religion is genetic in some way.
Mm-hmm.
What religion you are supposed to be is written into your very DNA.
Mm-hmm.
If we've run the experiment now for 1,000 years,
Mm-hmm.
and prior to 60 years ago, you know, paganism, Norse paganism wasn't a thing. You had 1,000 years of generations of people being born Christian.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that the DNA itself didn't? Wouldn't the DNA, if the DNA can express religiosity and the children keep being born, somehow being born Christian, wouldn't they then say, like, well, the genes have been modified over 1,000 years? They're now all Christian.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because the rhetorical exercise that you can do is say, our people were never intended to be Christian. We have labored for 1,000 years under a false faith, untrue to our inmost natures. Let us now return to the ancient ways engraved in our DNA, in our very blood, by our ancient ancestors.
I'm literally gripping my pants to keep myself from beating my chest.
Yeah, I'm feeling hair growing right here, even as I say that.
Meanwhile, as a woman, I'm just feeling deeply uncomfortable.
I just need a shield and a sword to knock on it.
Woman, you should have brought me a set of headphones that had horns on them. Okay.
Now I know what to do for you.
Right.
You know.
Anyway, as Laurel Mendez pointed out a ways earlier, if metagenetics really did work that way, then we all ought to be presumably some sort of African animists, because that's where humanity originated. We've spent much longer time, or our ancestors did, running around on the African savannas. Humanity didn't enter Europe until about 40-ish thousand years ago, and couldn't get into Scandinavia until less than 10,000 years ago because it was covered in ice now before that. So yeah, if we're going by, total length of time, we all ought to be, African animists, I don't know, carving giraffes in our rock art in the Sahara Desert or something like that. Religious ideas change, and they change a whole lot faster because even if you just look at, Scandinavia in the past 10,000 years, what we know about religion of the Neolithic and then of the Bronze Age is pretty darn different from what we know of Viking era religion. And you've had statements made on the folkish side that our religion has been fundamentally unchanged for the past 40,000 years, ever since humanity appeared in Europe. Really, no, it hasn't. And everything we know suggests that religious beliefs change on a much faster time scale than DNA generally does. And the same is true for language, of course. I'm not genetically different in any way worthy of mention from my presumed ancient Anglo-Saxon ancestors. And yet linguistically, we could never understand each other. I'd have a heck of a time trying to make myself understood if I traveled back to Wessex in the 7th century or something like that. So language and culture and religion shift a whole lot faster than human DNA generally can.
And I think that I think that there's definitely a sense of, would you say there's a sense of like almost ignoring the facts and the discoveries that we have on that? Because it seems to me like we have evidence to the contrary, even in journals like Mankind. Because I know when you and I were looking at Indo-European history for Heathen History, which, by the way, check out Heathen History podcast. I'm just saying. Mankind, of course, being one of the Indo-European kind of places where Indo-European studies has been published. And that's right there in black and white about kind of that evolution of belief.
Yeah. And we have plenty of evidence, and a lot of it now coming from studies of DNA extracted from, ancient burials, that people moved around a hell of a lot, that most Europeans are mixtures of populations of hunter-gatherers plus a population of farming people moving up from what's now Turkey, plus a population of people moving in from the east, probably the speakers of Proto Indo-European, although maybe conceivably caveat arm wave. And most European people are mixtures of all of those and quite possibly more. Those groups have various links to other groups far away. The presumed Indo-European speakers do share some distant but still measurable genetic ancestry with an Asian population that also was related to the ancestry of Native Americans, for example. People move, people shift. People who are sufficiently horny have never particularly worried about, ethnic and racial barriers. People will screw anything, basically. And people have swapped genes, all through their history, and you can't divide up humanity into these nice, neat little boxes. It just does not work.
I also wanted to I didn't want to jump in on the salaciousness, but I did want to just to further clarify the Indo-European story as it's typically presented by people who are of a more folkish, is like that the Indo-Europeans came and conquered like we're conquerors of Europe, and what you're looking at is a much more broad incorporation of this language group into Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and not any particular one. You have
Yeah.
hundreds of different people, tribes moving throughout time and at
Mm-hmm.
different points. It's not simply one day the charioteers rode in and conquered everything, and that's what they
Mm-hmm.
did. And they, the blonde beast took everything.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not
Right.
what the evidence shows.
Yeah, that's been presented positively by some of the more racist types out there. It's been presented as a tragedy by people like Rian Eisler and her book, The Chalice and the Blade, um, which tells the story as a sort of, matriarchal egalitarian utopia in Southern Europe and the Balkans that got trashed by the onslaught of the savage sword wielding patriarchy that subjugated women and destroyed nature and are basically responsible for everything bad that's happened ever since. The picture from archaeology is now showing it's a lot more nuanced. There were some pretty well advanced civilizations in Southern Europe, and they transform, often collapsing, at about the same time that presumed Indo-European speakers are coming in. But there was also climate change going on. There seems to have been violence not caused by outsiders, just violence between city states in this old Europe culture. And I'm not saying that the oncoming Yamnaya people who we think spoke Indo-European were exactly saints. And there probably was some looting and pillaging and, dirty deeds done with sheep. But it wasn't a single great wave of conquest sweeping out. It was probably a lot more complex. It was probably a lot more like alliances between cities and nomads and groups exchanging members and exchanging wives and integrating more like that. There was certainly a lot of change and certainly some violence, but there's no evidence now that it was a wave of savages sweeping out like the Mongol hordes. That was that's an anachronism there. People weren't able to do that back then.
So it's not backed up by biology,
Mm-hmm.
not backed up by history,
Right.
it's not backed up by archaeology,
Right.
and yet, so I guess we just say, like, okay, guys, we debunked it. It's done. We will never hear about this again.
Well, I'm not even done debunking it, but go ahead.
Well, it's since it doesn't it makes no sense with regards to genetics, makes no sense with regards to what we know about history and archaeology. Therefore, we will never hear about this again. It will never pop up on another forum. It's done. We've successfully combated the misinformation with the good information. So we shall never hear of this again. I, of course, am kidding. This will be on TikTok tomorrow. But just to show the persistence of these kinds of narratives. What is it that this is doing?
It persists because it's appealing to people who would really like to have a simpler world where you don't have to worry about messiness and nuance, where you can color code people the way you'd color code wires in your house, and everybody knows just what to do. And I'm going to drag something else in that might be worthy of another Althing Considered later on, but where I hear this now is not quite so much about race, but a lot more about gender. Because I'm seeing people in my very limited social media experience saying things like, look, the biology shows that you're either XX, and that means you've got a uterus, and that means that you have to like Barbie dolls and playing Tea Party with your teddy bear, or you have XY, and that means you've got a penis, and that means you like guns and playing football and scratching your balls and farting. And anybody that thinks differently is deluded. They've decided because of, I don't know, Obamacare and Taylor Swift and whatever it is, that they're going to be these strange little girl boys walking around. But fundamentally, you are either a male boy man or a female girl woman, and there simply are no other options. And if you think there are, you are wrong and you are deluded, and you deserve to be excluded from bathrooms and whatever it is that they're freaking out about now. Our state governor published an executive order recently forbidding certain words in state publications, and it begins with, whereas women are women, whereas the XX chromosome is an XX chromosome. And what makes that funny is there's no such thing as an XX chromosome. She basically fails at biology right out of the freaking gate. But thinking that way appeals to people who want everything to be simple and who want things not to change and who don't want to deal with the very rapid pace of social reorganization that we've been going through ever since the 60s.
Yeah.
And
I'd also state that, like, even though a mistake was what we call a school child mistake, right, was made on on this executive order, the executive order still goes through, right? It gets to make regardless of the mistakes on it, it still gets to do what it wants to do.
Yeah. The executive order is not a scientific paper. It's more of a performative act for people that share that ideology.
Yeah.
And as someone who is in, let's just say someone whose work could be directly affected by this executive order, the executive order affected exactly one thing in the entire state government, and that was a federal document we couldn't change. So I'm just going to put that out there. It was useless. It was political theater. But yeah, it is. I think that there, and we could certainly worth digging into the psychology of fear of change and how that weighs into this. But I do think that there definitely are a lot of people, there are a lot of people that don't want to think for themselves. And this is not just a pagan, this is just life, right? There are a lot of people who don't want to think for themselves, who just want, we refer to them as back row Baptists, right? They just want to show up, be told how to believe, what to think, whatever, so that then they can go home and, do their thing. But the whole point is, like, they want it spoon fed to them, I guess is a good way to put it.
Well, it's, to an extent, I think that's a very general human trait. Probably dating back to the time when we lived in extended families that weren't much larger than 100 people. And, an awful lot of tribal peoples have names for themselves, meaning that translate as the real people. And the surrounding tribes are called, the stupid people who talk funny and are not real people. Or something like that in the local language.
One of the more amusing things about language is that usually the people that live the closest, so the word that people have for the people that live next door who speak a different language is usually the word for their nationality is usually some variant of people I can't understand.
Right. The Russian word for German is related to the Russian word for mute.
Niemiec.
Yeah, Niemiecki. Yeah. That shows up there's a couple of Native American tribes where that happens as well. it's very easy to think in this tribal sense where we make fine distinctions among the people that we know, and groups outside of our immediate circle are written off as those other people who don't look like us and are not real people, and also they talk funny or what have you. And it takes mental effort and mental discipline to open your mind a little bit and realize that other people are full individuals that have their own stories and their own ideals and their own understandings of who they are, and the fact that they're not familiar to you does not make them intrinsically invalid. And in support of that, jumping back to history a little bit, because I've got just a little bit more debunking to do, when we've looked at DNA from ancient burials, there was a study a couple of years ago of burials from early Anglo-Saxon England, soon after the speakers of Old English turned up in Britain. The story is that a great wave of invaders came and banded together and formed an army and dispossessed the Romano-British Celtic speakers and pushed them off into Wales and Cornwall. And King Arthur managed to hold out against the Saxons for a while, but ultimately, you know the story. What they found was that in this elite cemetery, about half the skeletons had genetic links to modern day Denmark and the Netherlands, which is exactly what you'd expect. But about half of them were genetically more similar to Celts. Everybody had been buried in this, Anglo-Saxon elite fashion, with, the grave goods and things like that. And that suggests they were all following the same religion, because the closest thing we have to a guide to what religion somebody followed is to look at their burial and look at the grave goods that they were given. It's not perfect, but it shows you, what how communities identify these people. So they're all sharing similar beliefs about religion, or at least about death and afterlife. And yet genetically, they're very different. And we have these different populations that had been in conflict, but they'd also at the same time assimilated quite a bit. And we have a number of cases of burials from Scandinavia of people that went through Norse-style burials and yet have genetic links to people like the Sami or the Slavs, even a few from farther east in Siberia. So we've got lots of evidence from pre-Christian times that people from a very different ethnic background could be accepted and could be treated as followers of the Norse or Anglo-Saxon religious traditions, at least as far as you can read that from looking at grave goods and burials. So even if you look at archaeology, we can find plenty of instances where culture trumped ethnic descent. So yeah, right there, we've got metagenetics failing as an explanation for the things that we see. There were plenty of cases where people adopted new ways that had nothing to do with their ancestry. And nobody saw anything wrong with that. Okay, rant over. Where was I?
I guess I wanted to put the similar question to both of you, since you guys have done a lot of heathen history stuff. Again, you talk. One of the things that's coming to mind right now is that the metagenetics misinformation is part of a greater story complex. This is something that I've picked up from, I think, George Lakoff, who wrote the book Don't Think of an Elephant, which is basically about like story complexes and how framing, how frames are built. And the more I looked at it, the more I look at metagenetics it's misinformation. It's not, it's almost not intended. It's almost not intended to be factual. It's intended to feed into a greater story about identity, about belonging. That, as you say, it's a story about everything being in its right place. And what I hear from it is, from that particular story, is, and there's a place for you here. And it's not for them, right? Not for them. They can't have that place. You get to have this special place,
right,
for you. And it's always been there. That's why the coming home, right? That's we need our people to come home. And it's extremely powerful image, an extremely powerful frame and story. And my question back is, like, if I've got that story frame in mind, if you knock out metagenetics, I don't know if what's that going to do for my frame? Am I going to, what does that do for me? I might then be kind of lost in a drift. Like, what does my life even mean anymore?
What is truly mine?
Yeah, what is mine? Where do I belong?
Yeah.
And if I think one of the phrases that sticks with me is, like, people have a hard time understanding things that they're paid not to understand. That they're paid not to, but also, or they have incentive to not understand, I would say. And I might not say to myself, like, oh, I might just go ahead and kind of put metagenetics on the background, not question it, because maybe my friends, I think all my friends believe it, or I'm part of a group that has that story complex in there, and I can't question it. If I do, I'm going to be out. I'm going to be out of friends. I'm going to be out of this community, out of this idea of belonging that I've built for myself.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing that's been a trend that's been going on for a long time, shows no signs of stopping, is, okay, in the 50s, not everybody experienced this, but in your stereotypical, Archie Bunker lifestyle, you didn't have TV, you certainly didn't have anything like the internet, but people had networks. I mean, they went to church, they participated in church groups. Dad would go out bowling one night a week. There were community groups, you might join the JCs or the Lions, or, Dad might be in a fraternal lodge like the Elks or the Odd Fellows or the Loyal Order of the Water Buffalo. Well, that was the Flintstones, but something analogous to that. And people had communities of people who knew them and whom they knew, not necessarily deep and close friends, but they were embedded in networks of social relations. And we've lost an awful lot of that. Most people don't, have a bowling league one night a week or something like that. The internet is proving to be kind of a piss poor replacement for that sort of thing. I mean, Facebook groups are all very well, but they can't take the place of, the camaraderie you might get joining your church's Dorcas Society or some such.
Yeah.
And there is a very powerful feeling of atomization, of loneliness in American society right now. And that's not going away. That's not going anywhere. And people are always going to need to fill that with something. And I hope that heathenry in some way can, but it's difficult because, we're still very few and very scattered. And, that when we get people asking, writing to the Troth and asking questions, almost the most common question is there a kindred near where I live? And all too often we have to say no. And I think metagenetics is in part has its appeal because it appeals to the idea that you've got friends and you've got buddies and you've got natural people who get you. That, in the words of one of the cultural touchstones of my childhood, that there's a place where everybody knows your name and they're always glad you came. And now I've just earwormed everybody.
Yeah, I would like also to say, from a psychological point of view, from my research on this, and my own work in de-radicalization, you also have a way of, you have a lot of, and you really have since the civil rights movement, you have a whole several generations now of young men who feel very white young men, poor white young men specifically, a very specific kind of demographic, who feel very disenfranchised. And it has spread to young women as well now, who feel lost. They see kind of this rise of what they perceive as other groups having a culture where they don't. They feel that they lack an identity in a way that other groups have. And this is a way to feel like they have an identity and don't have to feel bad for having that identity.
And this comes out of the A-Free's formation in the early 70s. If you look at the early 70s, okay, the civil rights movement has sweepingly reformed our legal system. You have people pushing it farther, including slightly scary groups like the Black Panthers, who I don't think were particularly violent, but who certainly frightened a lot of white people. You've got the Chicano labor movement going on. Cesar Chavez is leading strikes. You've got first wave feminism is in full roar. The American Indian movement is doing things like occupying Alcatraz. You've got Title IX, a body of federal law is getting passed that mandates equal educational opportunity for women. You've got the Americans with Disabilities Act being passed. You've got Time magazine running a cover article on the rise of occults and pagan groups. You know, one of the first times that really broke into the mainstream. You've got Stonewall is still fresh. You know, gay liberation is in full swing. And one of the things you find in Steve McNallen's early writings is a lot of, hey, what about white men? What is, you know?
Hey, what about us? What about white men? I got you. You cut out there, Ben. We lost you for a second.
Yeah, what you get is, okay, Steve McNallen saying a lot of things like, hey, what about us poor white guys? Who's taking care of us? Who's looking out for us? They're now giving rights to, you know, the gay, transsexual, Inuit, disabled, you know, lesbian, left-handed pipe fitters. What about us regular people? And a lot of that ultimately informs a lot of his writing. I think it's a lot of the experience of growing up in the 70s and seeing a lot of these formerly marginalized groups demanding to no longer be satisfied with a position on the margins. And a lot of what McNallen wrote in the early issues of the Runestone is fundamentally a reaction to that. I'm not saying I think it was a particularly good reaction, but it's a reaction.
And I know a lot of what McNallen said in there is very, I know you and I have a similar experience here. You know, living in Arkansas, we have the unfortunateness of having several very active racist groups in our backyard that we have dealt with, unfortunately. Some of them Odinist in nature. It's the same recruitment tactics that these groups have. I remember some of those, I mean, very similar words being used on flyers in a town just an hour north of here, when the group White Revolution, which was an Odinist group, was trying to recruit there. You have a very similar situation, I think. And it's definitely, I do feel like there's, and of course the answer to all of this was, the root of all this is, of course, capitalism. But, what do I know?
But Laura, I did actually want to ask you about the alienation, the experience of disorientation, alienation, as the president and CEO of a religious education organization. What does an organization like the Troth do to make meaning for people, make meaning for people, or create frames for people, or pull them together to say, like, we're your people, you as opposed to a people, an idea of a people based on this kind of abstract concept of whiteness. Your belonging here, your belonging here is based on this, is based on what? Okay, how do different organizations present that feeling, that same feeling of belonging, that same feeling of being taken care of, same feeling of being looked out for, that Ben was talking about, like, who's looking out for us? That same feeling that people are looking for, and finding these overarching narratives that are saturated in racism, bigotry, and white supremacy.
Well, you know what? Instead of like saying overarching, I'm going to give some examples of people in our organization who are officers who I think are doing an excellent job, and how we're wanting to take some of these ideas and roll them out kind of widely. And this all comes down to our stewards, first of all. The stewards are the backbone of our organization. Our stewards are our local representatives. I think almost everyone I know who is in higher up levels of leadership in the Troth started out as a steward. I did. You're a steward currently. Ben Waggoner was we all kind of started as a start out. And I think that a great part of that is the stewards helping create community locally, whether that is people like our Alabama steward, Jay, who has office hours at a local meadery once a month. People like Piper Perry, who's our public relations director and one of our co-hosts here on Althing Considered, who puts together a Colorado meetup and monthly newsletter. People in other areas who are constantly doing meetups, like in all of our other states. People, or even just our stewards who say, "Oh, you're in, for me, oh, you're in Jonesboro. Hey, let me get you in hold of so and so. They're up in Jonesboro." And you start playing kind of like heathen matchmaker. And I think that's a big part of it. I think, too, is education. For instance, and a big part of that is in education for our officers, for our representatives, and our members. And that is, for instance, one of the things we do is providing education on not just inclusivity topics, but things like, for instance, next week, a bunch of us are taking a class on suicide prevention, so that when people reach out to the organization, because a lot of people reach out in times of crisis, we're able to be better trained to help them. We have a clergy who help in times of spiritual crisis. And the other thing that we've been doing that you have been a big part of, as well as our clergy, and I will say this right now, and thank you to Diana and Ethan and Mara, is doing online, these streaming rituals that we've been doing. And the feedback from that has been tremendous, with people saying, I don't feel so alone. I have someone to celebrate these holidays with. I'm the only heathen I know locally. And then, frankly, our Heathen Essentials classes, a lot of the stuff we do, I think, helps because it gives people a community. Our Discord server is great. It's such a community, even though, and things like Virtual Troth Mute, as well as a project that I'm working on that I'm not going to name right now, but a project I'm working on right now that will hopefully help us build and sustain more kindreds around the country. And And I do think that that's a huge part of it. It's all about helping people find and create community, be it online because of limitations they have. And it's more than just like there's not heathens nearby. We have people who are, we have people who are disabled, quadriplegic, can't leave their house, who are shut in. I really think that it's the responsibility of religious organizations, not just the Troth, but literally anyone who espouses inclusivity and wants to create places that are positive. And these conversations I have with friends of mine who are ministers, who are Christian, we all kind of have this thought process. If we want to create a place that is positive and engaging and inclusive, part of that is creating spaces that are welcoming to everyone who shares our beliefs, our inclusive beliefs. And that also means being a little gatekeepy, I hate to say, in the sense that we create spaces where we're not going to tolerate bigotry. We're not going to tolerate people being jerks, and we're not going to tolerate people mistreating other people, no matter their race, ethnicity, disability, whatever. I think that that's where we're going to end up. How we're doing this, and I think that's what the Troth does well and does the best at, in my opinion, is creating a space where we're not going to tolerate bigotry. At the same time, one of the ways I think we can all learn, and it's a problem here in our spaces, is we do get too reactionary, and it's everybody, right? Like, I'm not being with people making mistakes. And I do think that we do need to all learn how to give people a little more grace. And if people are learning and growing, then that's great. Because people are going to make a mistake. There are words that I did not know were slurs, and I have used because I didn't know they were slurs. And when I found out, I stopped using them. Right? I mean, the word crazy is a great example. I've been working very hard to take that word out of my vocabulary as meaning something, wild or weird, right? And instead I try to replace it with wild. Instead of saying that's crazy, saying that's wild. It's giving people the grace to learn and grow. And I think that's also an important thing. I think people are sincere and they want to learn and grow, then we have to do it, and we have to be there. And also, one of the other things we can do is make sure that they don't go down the wrong path by doing things like putting up a great website full of really great information that is SEO optimized and outranks all the other bad stuff that are done by really talented marketing people like Benny the Younger.
Yeah, Taylor up here has a really good comment saying that, inclusive heathens need to be supportive of newcomers. It is 1,000 times easier to head people off from falling down the racist rabbit hole than it is to get them out once they're embedded in that. It can be done, but it's a whole lot easier. And it's always been tough for the Troth as a small organization, because when we're small, we don't have enough boots on the ground to offer community to a lot of the people who are seeking it. And if we can't offer community to a lot of the people who are seeking it, we remain small. So for a long time, I think we were kind of trapped in this sort of loop where we didn't have enough people to provide community, and we couldn't provide enough community to attract more people. Now, our esteemed founder, Edward Thorson, in a book of his a couple of years ago, has complained quite a bit that the Troth is not doing what he had in mind for it to do, which was to provide a space for both the folkish and the more inclusive to come together in worship. But now we're taking these stands and we're keeping people out, and we're supporting all of the left-handed transgender whatever the heck it is, and we're doing it wrong.
Ben, I just want to address the concern real quick. I don't know if you said esteemed quite sarcastically enough.
It was.
Just need to soak that. Just for our listeners, soak in that esteemed and sarcasm.
Yeah, he will never not be the Troth's founder. He's always going to be part of our DNA. but his plan for what we were is something we have gotten very far away from. And listening to him rant about why we need to be a place that accepts both the folkish and the inclusive, it's kind of like he's saying, you know, why can't we get the sulfur, the saltpeter, and the charcoal to come together in peace and harmony? In case anybody did not catch that, that's the recipe for gunpowder. You know, you put those things together and you're not going to create a really welcoming space for anybody. And it's only since we started taking a more explicitly, openly inclusive stand that we've really started growing the way that we have. I mean, you have to do a certain amount of gatekeeping. You have to do a certain amount of gatekeeping if you want to create a space where people can feel comfortable. Or, as I like to put it, the problem with having a big tent organization is the tent is never big enough for all the clowns that try to come in.
I just want to make an official statement about what he said. And this is an official, Lauren is president of the Troth statement here. Sorry, not sorry.
Well, I wanted to say
that's my official statement. Sorry, not sorry.
In history of this not working. The gunpowder analogy.
There was a reason I quit the Troth in the 2000s, and that was it.
We have a long list of meeting minutes, which I would just call receipts, that show some of this in very sanitized form because they're meeting minutes. But you actually see this conflict explode on occasion. And guys, when I looked at this, I'm like, guys, we tried. it's not lack of trying. It just work. I'm sorry.
Edward, if you ever see this, we did try it your way, and we had blow-ups every 6 months or so, and we couldn't ever seem to get past that until we made a more forceful statement of exactly who we were and what we'd tolerate and what we wouldn't. And a comment has just come in that if it's good for us to gatekeep, then it should be okay for AFA types to gatekeep. Sure, let them gatekeep all they want. They're fine. I hope they don't let me into their organization. I hope they don't want people like me. They are free to shut me out as much as they want to. That's fine. You know, let them stay in their own little inbred, gated community of the mind. Sure. You know, why not?
Well, and here's the thing. Here is the thing, though. We don't gatekeep our information, right? So, like, as far as gatekeep, right? I want to address this because I think this is really important. We're not gatekeeping our religion, right? No one is saying they can't be anything, right? No one is saying they can't worship these gods. What we're saying is they are fundamentally wrong about when they restrict who can worship the gods. We don't say they can't be. There's a difference between their restricting and our restricting, right? Their gatekeeping is, according to their gatekeeping, me and Benny the Elder, shouldn't be heathen because I have Jewish ancestry. Ben's wife is not white. I mean, by this definition, we're not going to be acceptable for us to be heathen. I have no problems with Steve McNally being heathen. I have no problems with whoever else is in the AFA being heathen. My problem is them telling me or anyone else who can be heathen, right? That's where the problem lies.
Yes.
So they're the ones gatekeeping. All we're doing is saying, if you want to join our organization, you have to agree to our rules to come play in our playground, but doesn't stop you from reading our website or doing any of this other stuff. Sorry, it's just a trigger point for me.
But I wanted to get this. I wanted to give the distinction here, like getting back to what an earlier user said about welcoming newcomers, and gatekeeping certainly comes into it. I think that when I think about my attitude towards newcomers, towards people coming into this religion, I don't want to intervene to necessarily just because I'm afraid they're going to become racist if I don't. my attitude is I invite people to be part of this religion. I welcome them. I not only welcome, but I invite them. Right? I'm inviting you in. I am you are now. I am now giving hospitality to you, the newcomer. I have invited you in, and I want to extend that invitation to anybody who wants to be in this religion. I extend this invitation to people who even haven't thought of it yet. You're invited. You're invited to be heathen. And it's because of that invitation, because of that hospitality, that I'm not saying I need to intervene because I'm afraid of someone going down the wrong path. I want to intervene because I've invited you here, right? I'm extending the invitation. If someone wants to be heathen, great. I'm inviting you in. You're welcome, and you're welcome to it, right?
I disagree.
Will be the best host I can be.
I disagree with you, Ben. And the reason is self-preservation. As a woman, specifically, as a queer woman who is disabled, I am under constant threat by the right wing and right-wing heathens, especially. And I am in the middle of it. I mean, there is a literal documentary on this platform, on YouTube, by NBC, called A Mother Turns to Hate. If you've not had 30 minutes of your time and you're watching this after this is done, please go take some time to watch it. It's about the radicalization and Odinists that live 30 minutes away from Ben and I. So to me, it is absolutely self-preservation, especially having friends who work with radicalizing people and getting people out of racist heathenry specifically, but racist groups, and having several friends who have de-radicalized out of that. It is absolutely, for me and for a lot of people that I love, this is self-preservation.
Right. Well,
Because
Kyle,
I'm scared.
Kyle Reese in the comments brings up Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, except I don't think it's really a paradox. But the point is that you can't tolerate the intolerant or your arrangement falls apart. And so I would say I am perfectly willing to welcome people into my religion. I am perfectly willing to offer you hospitality, but hospitality carries obligations on both sides. If I'm going to invite you into my house, you in turn have an obligation not to pee on the floor and rape my appliances. Or, ouch. Sorry, mental image there that probably really should not have brought up.
Listen, here's the thing. There's heathenry teaches hospitality. It also teaches being a good guest. And I'm there with you, Ben.
Right.
I'm down with you.
Yeah, it teaches reciprocity. And we should certainly be hospitable to as many people as possible, but we can't be hospitable to people who are not going to reciprocate with tolerance and acceptance in turn. You can't allow people into the party if you know that the first thing they're going to do is poop in the punch bowl. Okay. Sorry. Okay, my metaphors have gotten a little bit gross, so sorry about that.
I completely agree.
And no, Kyle, I will leave your toaster unviolated.
I completely agree with the metaphors. But I also agree with the tolerance of paradox too, and that's why I think of when creating an inclusive community, when creating a community that welcomes all people, that community necessarily becomes anathema to people who are intolerant. They don't want to be there. Right. It makes it necessarily, even if I were holding the door open for them and saying, come in, like, be a part of this wonderful rainbow of people we have in here. Because all are welcome, they would say, no, I don't want to be there. I don't want to be in that place. That place makes me upset. Even if they were to come in, they wouldn't want to be there. Like it upsets their very nature. If they don't want to hang out with what they call like blue-haired freaks, I don't know. I haven't had blue hair since I was 18, but okay. If they don't want to hang out with us, fine. The party's going on in here. We're all in here. If you don't want to be a part of it, don't.
And I think that's the thing with inclusive heathenry that we miss, all of us miss. And I used to have this conversation. I've had this conversation with Ben several times, with my Ben. And that is, in the ideal world, we need to heathenry in general, but inclusive heathenry special. What we really need to do is just create something that people want, right? Create a community, create a kindred, create an organization. And that was my goal when I came into as president, or came onto the board even. How do we create something where we're having such a good time that other people want in on this action? Kind of like, when you open up the hottest new, where I live in Arkansas, in Little Rock, we have the same people that just close and open restaurants with new names all the time. And people are dying to get in because it's the new hip restaurant. And they want it because they see it and it's cool and it looks fun. So to me, it's like, how do we create something that's cool and fun and we love it so much that other people want it because they see this and they're like, that's what I want. See how happy these people are. See how much they're enjoying life. See how enriched they are by their heathenry. I want that. And
don't need nothing but some heathens, and they don't get better than this.
Exactly.
How much more do you need, guys? How much more do you need?
And so to me, that I think is a super important part of this, is looking at how do we create something? Because here's the thing. People are always, when people join, I know this was kind of metagenetics and we've kind of drifted, and I'm sorry. But, a lot of these are conversations that Ben Waggoner and I have had. People join groups like the AFA because the AFA is constantly doing stuff. They're constantly providing and doing stuff. And, I think that it's, they're doing stuff, but they're doing it for underhanded reasons. They're doing it to recruit you into their cultic pyramid scheme, their racist cultic pyramid scheme. When we do stuff, it's much more altruistic, and that makes it harder because of we don't operate as a dictatorship. We don't operate with one person in charge. And I think that is part of it. So the question becomes, for all of us inclusive heathens, whether you're a member of the Troth or you're not, whether you love the Troth or hate the Troth, if you consider yourself an inclusive heathen, how can you improve your inclusive heathenry in your group, your presence, to make inclusive heathenry look like the coolest thing on the block compared to all other forms of heathenry?
I would also say that it's not necessarily being the coolest, but the one that I was talking with our military steward about this, the one that gives people the best chance to be their best, that gives them the best chance to be their best selves. Ultimately, I think people join these kinds of organizations, join religious groups, or join this kind of stuff because they want something for themselves, not just to be cool necessarily or to have fun, but to become the best versions of them that they can be. Altruistic, generous, hospitable, compassionate, kind. They want a venue, they want a place to express this stuff. I mean, I might be a bit of an optimist, but I think people, when they think about their best selves, they are thinking of themselves as being a good person, a kind person, a courageous person. And an organization that can show convincingly that we can help, and this is a community of people who will help you, and this is where you belong, to be that good person. We want you to be that good person. We're going to support you being that good person that we know you can be. You're invited. It's in here. Not my wall. This is a wall. This is just a wall. There's not a door back here, but metaphorically speaking, welcome.
But yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. I will also say, though, I do think that when I say cool just to me, when I say cool, I just mean encompassing everything that people want. whether that is making you a better person or fulfilling the needs you have to teach spirituality to your children, whatever. Cool to me is just that word that encompasses the it vibe, that is fulfilling what people want. And that just, sorry, that comes from my years of
I
broadcasting.
haven't been it since 2002.
Yeah. The way that the kids say these days, being groovy, daddy-o, right?
That's
Yeah.
quite corking there, sir.
I realized I wasn't cool when I was looking at the MTV Awards and realized I didn't know who anybody was except people getting like legacy awards. And I knew I was old at that point, y'all. But just to kind of reframe back, I really think, here's the thing. There's been someone in our comments who has been going on and on about why do we have to be so intolerant on the left, right? Like, why can't we have everyone get along? And the fact of the matter is that we have people in our organization who are queer, trans, non-binary, disabled, non-white, name it, right? And our job as an our duty as an organization, our religious duty, is to create a space of hospitality for them, where they don't feel. Here's the thing: when I joined the Troth in 2004, 2004, the first time, it was very hard to feel welcome just as a woman, let alone as a queer disabled woman, right? And I felt like I had to fight for my place. And I quit because I left after it got really ugly because, quite frankly, it just became a cluster fire. So I don't want anyone else to feel that way. I wrote an essay, it's up on our website, where I basically said, if you're someone who has felt marginalized in other groups, you don't have to fight for your seat at the table. It's waiting for you. And that's the thing. We have to keep places safe and kind. Right. And if people who are on the far right deny the personhood of people like me, of people who are queer and trans and bi and non-white. And so to me, saying that they're not welcome in our spaces is about setting ground rules of grith and frith and saying, listen, in order to make our space somewhere that is full of frith and harmony and and the values of heathenry that I hold so dear, we have to say we cannot tolerate bigotry. We cannot tolerate something else we don't tolerate in our organization is telling other people how exactly to worship, right? Because there's no dictatorial thing that says there's only one way you can worship, right? There's only one way you can bloat. And as a heathen, that's not true. And I know that. I'm old enough to know that. But, we do that for the frith. We have rules in our chat groups about not self-promotion. That, every group has rules in order to keep that group functioning. And I'm very proud of how well our organization functions compared to where we were 20 years ago or 10 years ago.
Yeah. And purely from a point of view of self-interest, from the very beginning, some of the best stuff that the Troth has ever done has been spearheaded by people who were, in fact, queer, trans, not fully European racially, whatever the heck that even means. We've had a lot of people who have worked hard for us and done great things for us and helped us move forward and, continue to do that to this day. And I've always felt that from a completely pragmatic point of view, racism makes no sense because we have a lot of, issues and problems and challenges facing us. And if we exclude any contribution You know, whether that's solving a problem or completing a task or, you know, creating something beautiful, if we exclude those because they're not coming out of bodies that are, you know, white and straight and cisgendered, you know, we're throwing away an enormous amount of potential. You know, there's no good reason to exclude beautiful poetry or great labors of service or leadership because of the bodies that they come out of that don't happen to be 100% straight heterosexual European prime beef. You know, our diversity really has been our strength, and I can think of examples of that going all the way back to our founding.
Well, I'm just going to put this out here. One of the things that is very pushed by far right heathenry is traditional gender roles. Do you like having a cell phone? Everybody here like having cell phone, like having internet, like having radio, communications, you know, like all that? You can
Yes,
thank
I do.
women for that because the idea, cell phones, basic Wi-Fi, all of that comes from a woman. A woman developed that. You know, do you like computer programming? A Lovelace, baby. I mean, a lot of that stuff came from
Yes.
women.
And I want to say too,
Yeah.
the notion that we, I have a resentment, a little bit of something sticks in my craw whenever someone categorizes the Troth as necessarily leftist. I don't know when exactly, because when I think about accepting trans people, accepting all people, this seems to be more like when did this become anything but centrist and very liberal? Because it's a very, to me, is like this just as an indication of how far, let's say, the Overton window has shifted here, is that suddenly it's a radical position to accept people, and it's a radical left position, and frankly, it's not. I don't think there's nothing inherently leftist about it, as far as I understand the political divides between left and right. But the shift here to say that somehow we're some kind of radical leftist organization when all we're doing is just accepting people, regardless of or race, ability, sex, gender, like the United Nations, the famous leftist organization, the United Nations. Yeah, there's nothing particularly that I find is like leftist politically about that. There are certainly leftists in the Troth. There are certainly people on the right in the Troth. I just don't understand what makes the Troth itself, as opposed to any of our members, particularly leftist.
I would say that historically, since the Troth's founding, or at least since Prince Priest became the second steer, and was that 91, man? 92?
Sounds right. Maybe
You have
93.
those,
I'd have to look it up.
yeah, early 90s, we'll call it that.
Mhm.
You have those accusations because Prudence was a dual tradition, Wiccan and Heathen, or Ásatrú at the time, because everything was Ásatrú at the time. Here's the thing, though. If being called leftist because we're following what we believe is the correct interpretation of our faith, okay, sure, I don't care.
Yeah, no, it's just bizarre to me that
Mhm.
that the acceptance of people as they are is somehow leftist politically. It just doesn't. It's one of those things that sticks in my craw, because again, student of philosophy, student of political science, like the way I understand leftism is quite different. And I don't know why that would be. Again, I don't know why that would be a radical position. If you want to call us
Right.
leftist and label us leftist because we're pro LGBTQIA, BIPOC, go ahead.
Right.
I just want you to know how silly it sounds.
Yeah. Bringing this back kind of full circle, it goes back to the desire to divide everybody into nice, neat boxes of our kind of people and all those other people who talk funny and look funny, and they're not our people because they've got different skin or different places to stick their ding-a-ling or different political ideologies. it's that feeling of my in-group of people are the only people that have got it right and have got it figured out, and everybody else is doing something fundamentally flawed. And that's something that we saw, going back to the racist pseudoscience of the 19th century. And I think that's some of the motivation behind McNallen's original, metagenetics. And I think Chris Christopherson probably said it best. If you guys know the song, you can chime in. Does everybody needs somebody else to look down on so they can feel better than at any time they please? Someone's doing something dirty, decent folks can frown on. You can't find nobody else, then help yourself to me.
Oh, I thought we could go back even farther to National Brotherhood Week. National Brotherhood Week. National everyone smile at everyone else week. It's fun to eulogize the people you despise as long as you don't let them in your schools.
Killing me.
If you
could work some time error in there.
Yeah, I'm gonna like shamelessly promote that if you want to hear more singing, you should go listen to our podcast. It's called Heathen History. Ben and I do deep dives into the history of the modern heathen movement as well as modern paganism. We deep dive into metagenetics and AFA. We deep dive into Indo-European. And hopefully now that the remodeling is finally done on my house officially, my long nightmare is over. We are going to get back to recording. We've got some juicy stuff in the pipe. So just to let you guys know, I finished part 2 of a series. Yeah. So I just want to So Ben, let's just go with one thing here. What can genetics determine?
Okay. A lot less than you think. Genes are they are segments of a very long, complicated chemical molecule called DNA. And DNA got its name when its discoverers, Watson and Crick, stood up in front of a bunch of scientists and said, "We have discovered the chemical blueprint of all life. Dana!"
Oh, I love it. Yeah, I got it.
Okay. But DNA by itself does absolutely nothing. DNA by itself is basically just a chemical that you can, put in a test tube or something like that. For DNA to work, it has to be instantiated in a living cell. And the effect of genes is so heavily modified by, first of all, the effect of other genes, and second of all, by the environment that you're in. A very simple example of that that everybody's familiar with would be cats that have a gene called the Siamese allele develop pigmentation only on the parts of the body that are cold. So your Siamese cat is basically a black cat, except the ability to make black pigment is switched off, except on the cold parts of the body, right? The face, the ears, the feet, the tail. If you shaved a Siamese cat and put it in a cold environment, you would get a thoroughly pissed off cat that would crap in your shoes. But you would get a cat that would grow back black fur. My wife had a Siamese cat that was an outdoor cat, and she turned quite a bit darker every winter. Our own Siamese cat spends all of her time indoors in the warm, so we don't see that. But, the environment has a powerful effect on your phenotype, what you fundamentally are. And as much as we talk about finding a gene for, say, a certain disease, genes act together with each other in extremely complicated ways. The technical name for this being epistasis. Genes can be modified by the environment that they're in. We call that phenotypic plasticity. And in humanity, genes don't vary nearly as much as we think they do. This was first discovered by a guy named Richard Lewontin in, I want to say, the late 70s. And nobody believed him at the time, but it's been confirmed over and over again. Humans do vary genetically, but most of that variation is within group variation. In other words, if you could identify all of my genes that are different from anybody, from the rest of humanity, first of all, that's not very many. I'm mostly genetically identical to other humans, which is what makes me a human and not a zucchini. But of all those genes that vary among humanity, of all of my genes that are different from the rest of humanity, most of that variation is within my racial group. Most of the genes in me that are different, I either share with people who are not white Europeans, or I don't share with people who are. Very few of those variant genes that I have, I share with only people in my race as defined, and don't share with anybody who's outside. I'm not sure that I explained that very clearly. It's getting late and I'm getting a little tired, but there is very little genetic basis for what we traditionally think of as racial differences. People have been looking for it for years, and it really just is not there. There is genetic diversity, but the vast majority of it cannot be fit into these nice, neat, tight little cubby holes that we'd like them to fit into. The support for racism simply is not there. And the support for metagenetics has never been there.
It kind of reminds me of like the breast cancer gene. You can have the breast cancer gene. That doesn't mean you're going to have breast cancer. It's just a gene that indicates that your chances are higher.
Right.
But it's not a guarantee. Genes are not a guarantee. They're just an indicator.
Right. Right. And the effect of that breast cancer gene could be modified by lots of other genes and, any number of environmental factors. You can get breast cancer if you don't have that gene and yet just get unlucky and have, mutations in certain cells at the wrong time and place.
You can get breast cancer because you work in a dentist office and don't take proper precautions. Right. Your next race.
Yeah, genes do not nearly determine your destiny the way that some people think that they do.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Here almost every week.
I always love your company, but what's new?
Right.
Any final thoughts?
I think I just gave it.
Alrighty.
Okay.
Any final thoughts?
Genes are not your destiny. They are not your determination. They are not the ultimate source of human nature, and they have absolutely nothing to do with who you're called to worship. And Steve McNallen is a meanie poo-poo head.
All of these sound
there you
correct.
Go. And I got a PhD, so I know what I'm talking about. So yeah.
Thank you guys all for joining us tonight on Althing Considered. We will be back here next week, same time, same place. And thank you to our guest, Dr. Ben Waggoner, Dr. Benny the Elder. Thank you to our president and CEO, Lauren Crow. Thank you for the wonderful discussion that we had today. I hope it was helpful to folks out there. And we're going to send you on out. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful night.